She had been cast out like something broken, sent to the far edge of the valley, with nothing but calloused hands and a wound she would never speak aloud. For 3 years, Clara Whitaker had built something extraordinary from that exile brick-by-brick wheel of cheese by wheel of cheese, in a silence so deep it echoed. Then, on the coldest morning of the year, a stranger drove his cattle through her valley, stepped into her struggle without a word, and lifted not just the weight from her hands, but something far heavier she had been carrying all her life. This is the story of a woman who was told she was worth nothing, and the man who proved the whole world wrong. Stay with us to the very end. Drop a comment below and tell us what city you are watching from. Now let us begin. The wind came down off the ridge like a blade. It did not whisper or suggest. It cut clean and deliberate through every gap in the pine canopy and every crack between the logs of the small stone and timber cabin that sat at the far southeastern edge of Cedar Hollow. In January, this particular corner of the valley existed in a kind of gray suspended silence, the sort of silence that feels less like peace and more like the world holding its breath before it decides whether or not to finish you off. Clara Whitaker was not a woman who gave the world that kind of power over her. She was on her knees in the frozen mud of the lower barn at 4 in the morning, her breath coming out in great white plumes, her thick wool sleeves shoved up past her elbows despite the cold, her bare forearms slick with the particular combination of effort and consequence that comes with bringing a new life into the world when that new life is reluctant to arrive. The heifer, a young rust-colored dairy cow named Patience, which had always struck Clara as something between a prayer and a joke, had been laboring since midnight. The calf was presenting wrong. Clara had known it before she had even lifted the lantern to check. She had learned to know these things not from books, for books were scarce in Cedar Hollow, but from years of watching and doing and failing and trying again until the knowing settled into her hands like memory. Her hands were not small hands. They were broad across the knuckle and thick in the palm, the hands of a woman who had spent years lifting and hauling and churning and pressing. The skin across her knuckles had split and scarred and split again so many times that the texture was more landscape than skin, ridged and mapped like the valley floor she worked. Her fingers were strong enough to wring a mop dry with one hand or carry 2 full milk pails simultaneously without her pace breaking. Tonight, those hands were doing what they had always done best, finding the work that needed doing, getting low and steady, and refusing to quit. She repositioned herself, settling her weight back on her heels, and she used the considerable solidity of her build to her advantage, the way a carpenter uses a good square joint with purpose and with trust. Clara Whitaker was not a slender woman. She had not been a slender girl. Her frame was broad-shouldered and powerfully built, the kind of figure that could bear a full cord of split wood across her back or stand braced against a February gale without being moved. She stood 5 feet and 10 inches tall in her work boots, and not a single inch of her was wasted. Every part of her was load-bearing. Every part of her had earned its place. She bore down and shifted her grip and spoke quietly to Patience the way she always spoke to the animals in that low, unhurried register that seemed to travel through air and skin directly into whatever part of a creature understood that it was not alone. "Easy now, easy girl. I have you. We are going to do this together." There was no one else in the barn to hear her say it. There was no one else in the cabin either, or in the small stone spring house 20 yards to the north, or in the cheese-aging cellar dug into the hillside behind it. There was only the dark and the cold and the lantern light making orange shadows on the barn wall, and the heifer's labored breathing, and Clara's own stubborn, unbroken focus. The calf came in a long, effortful rush that required every ounce of leverage Clara could generate, and when it landed in the clean straw and took its first startled, gulping breath, Clara sat back on her heels and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory. Then she was moving again, clearing the calf's airway with practiced efficiency, rubbing it down with dry straw to get the circulation moving, guiding the stunned little creature toward its mother with the patient persistence of someone who had learned long ago that celebration is a thing you earn after the work is fully done. By the time the calf was nursing and patience had settled into the particular stillness of a new mother. Finding her footing, the eastern sky was beginning to consider the idea of light. Clara stood pressed both hands to the small of her back and rolled her shoulders in a slow rotation that produced a series of sounds not unlike a wagon wheel crossing a gravel road. She was 31 years old. Some mornings her body made her feel considerably older. She had stopped registering that as a complaint some years ago. It was simply information, data about effort expended and work accomplished. She carried the lantern out of the barn and across the yard to the cabin, and she built up the fire and put water on to heat, and stripped off her soiled outer layers with the detached efficiency of a woman who has no one to perform cleanliness for, and therefore simply achieves it. She washed her hands and forearms at the basin with the rough lye soap she made herself, watching the cold water run gray and then clear over her knuckles, and she did not look in the small tin mirror nailed above the basin. She had not developed that habit. She did not see the utility in it. She put on a clean shirt and buttoned it to the collar and went to the cheese cellar before the water had finished heating. The cellar was the center of everything Clara had built. It sat partially underground its entrance. A heavy oak door flush with the hillside, its interior carved from the living rock of the ridge, and then mortared over so that the temperature inside remained within a few steady degrees of constant, regardless of what the sky was doing overhead. It smelled the way she imagined a cathedral might smell if cathedrals were built by practical people for practical purposes. Earthy and complex and ancient, a living smell, the smell of time, doing its patient, invisible work on things that had been made with care. The wheels of cheese were arranged on pine shelving along both walls, each one dated and initialed in her own neat hand, each one at a different stage of its long, slow transformation from fresh curds to something remarkable. Clara moved through the cellar the way a woman moves through a space she has claimed completely without self-consciousness, without performance, touching each wheel in its turn, checking the rind, testing the firmness, making small notations in the worn ledger she kept on a shelf near the door. She had discovered her talent for cheesemaking the way she discovered most things about herself by necessity and accident, and a refusal to accept the first failure as a verdict. Her mother had sent her here with a single dairy cow, a basic kit of cheesemaking equipment, and the clear understanding that she was not expected to succeed at anything beyond not dying. The cow had been her first teacher. The land had been her second. The silence had been her third and most demanding, because it left her with no noise to hide behind and nothing to do with her mind but learn. She had learned. She had learned that a proper aged cheddar required more patience than she had initially believed she possessed, but that the belief was wrong, not the capacity. She had learned that the particular limestone composition of the water drawn from the spring behind the cabin gave her cheeses a mineral quality that was unlike anything produced in the lower valley or the township beyond. She had learned how to adjust her technique for the varying fat content of winter milk versus summer milk, and how to coax complexity from simple ingredients through the management of temperature and time and the precise introduction of specific cultures that she cultivated herself from batches going back nearly 3 years now. The wagon trains had started stopping in the second year. A westbound family had purchased a small wheel on a whim, finding her sign posted at the Cedar Hollow crossroads, and had mentioned it to the next family. They encountered 100 miles west, and that family had mentioned it to a freighter heading back east, and the freighter had come to her directly the following spring, with an order for 20 wheels and the information that people were calling it the best aged cheddar west of the Appalachians and east of the Pacific coast, which encompassed, she had noted dryly, a considerable amount of territory. She had not allowed herself to feel proud of this exactly. Pride felt like a door left open in a wind. She had allowed herself to feel useful, which was a different thing entirely and a great deal safer. The business had grown steadily. She kept meticulous accounts. She reinvested every dollar she could spare back into the operation, purchasing a second cow, then a third, then adding to the cellar capacity, then constructing a small spring house for the fresh milk and cream she also sold to travelers. She had learned to time her larger wheels to coincide with the peak wagon train season and to hold her most complex aged varieties for the merchants who came from the township twice yearly and paid in coin rather than trade. She was by every material measure succeeding. She did not think about what success cost when there was no one to share it with. Or rather, she had trained herself not to think about it during daylight hours. The nights were a different matter, and the nights were her own business. She closed the cellar and went back to the cabin and drank her tea standing at the window, watching the gray light strengthen over the ridge. The calf would need checking again in 2 hours. The morning milking was still ahead of her, then the pressing of the batch she had set to drain the previous evening, then the turning of the mid-stage wheels, then the hauling of the heavy storage vat from the spring house up to the cart for the monthly supply run to the crossroads trading post. That last task had been defeating her for 3 years. The vat was a problem of geometry and physics. It was an iron-bound oak container of a size that had seemed reasonable when she had purchased it second-hand from a dairy operation that had gone under, and it held when full approximately what it would take 2 strong men to lift without strain. Clara could manage it alone from most positions using her body weight and leverage and the particular technique she had developed through painful trial and error. But getting it from the ground onto the flatbed of the cart required a lifting height and angle that consistently outpaced what one person could generate safely. She had devised a system involving a rope, a pulley she had installed on a barn beam, and a great deal of controlled strength applied at precisely the right moment, and it worked roughly 7 times out of 10. The other 3 times produced varying degrees of disaster, the most recent of which had resulted in her spending an afternoon in the cold mud with a bruised shoulder and a quantity of partially frozen milk that was now simply lost, and a private declaration that she was going to solve this problem before the spring thaw arrived and the volume doubled. She had not yet solved it. She put her cup down and pulled on her coat. Outside, the cold was the kind that settles into the lungs and makes them work harder, and the sky had taken on the particular flat brightness that in Cedar Hollow in January often preceded snow. Clara assessed it the way she assessed all things practically and without drama, and determined that she had perhaps until midday before the weather decided its intentions clearly. She would do the milking first. Then she would attempt the vat. The 3 cows were placid and warm in the barn, radiating the comfortable bovine indifference to human difficulty that Clara had always found oddly comforting. Patience was still attentive to her calf, which was standing now on uncertain legs and possessed of an expression that Clara privately categorized as offended by the entire situation of existing. She milked in the steady rhythm that was simply part of her body now, the sound of it a kind of percussion regular and unrushed. She carried the full pails to the spring house and transferred the milk into the great vat with careful attention to not wasting a drop. Winter milk was richer, winter milk mattered. And then she stood and looked at the vat. And the vat looked back at her with the silent, implacable stubbornness of an object that does not care about your problems. She rigged the pulley system. She positioned the cart. She checked the wheel chocks twice. She took a long, slow breath and loaded her weight into the rope and got the vat to the lip of the spring house shelf, and then she was at the precise point where the geometry went wrong, the point where she needed to be both the source of upward force and the guide of directional movement simultaneously. And she was gripping the rim with both hands and the rope with one shoulder and the cart edge with a knee. And it was working. It was almost working. It was at the exact critical balance point where working and not working occupied the same breath, and then the cartwheel shifted 2 inches in the mud, and the angle changed, and the physics of the situation offered her its honest assessment. She held it. She held it through pure grinding will, her boots cutting furrows in the frozen mud, every muscle in her back and shoulders and thighs engaged in the singular project of not letting this become the 1 in 10 that went wrong, and she was making a low continuous sound that was not a groan and not a word and not quite a prayer, but existed in the same register as all 3. She did not hear the hoofbeats. The first she knew of another person's presence was when a second pair of hands appeared on the opposite side of the vat, broad-palmed and work-roughened, gripping the rim without hesitation, and then a shoulder appeared beside hers at the same height and in the same working angle, and without a single word exchanged the geometry of the problem was solved by the simple addition of a second body that understood instinctively and immediately what the work required. They lifted together. The vat settled onto the cart bed with a solid, satisfying clunk. Clara straightened and turned. He was tall, which she noticed because it was relevant information about very few men she had encountered, but it was relevant about him. He had the build of someone who had done physical labor since childhood without ever treating it as a hardship, lean in the way that hard work and plain food produce, with broad shoulders and hands that matched his frame. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, she estimated, with dark hair and several days of beard, and the kind of calm, direct eyes that suggested a person who did not spend a great deal of time performing versions of themselves for other people's benefit. He was not smiling in the way men sometimes smiled at her, that particular arrangement of the mouth that preceded the patronizing comment or the dismissive joke. He was not looking her over the way men sometimes looked at her, as an inventory of shortcomings. He was simply looking at her with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had just worked alongside another person and was now ready to exchange whatever words the situation required. "Wyatt Callahan," he said. "I am moving a small herd through the valley on the way south. I saw your sign at the crossroads." "Clara Whitaker," she said. Her voice came out steady. She had long practice at steady. "You are in the market for provisions." "I am," he said. "Aged cheddar if you have it, and whatever hard cheese travels well. I have 11 days of open country ahead before the next settlement." She studied him for a moment in the way she had learned to study people, quickly and thoroughly, reading the information available. His boots were well maintained, but honestly worn. His coat was good wool patched in 2 places with patches that matched the original fabric, which indicated either someone who took care of their possessions or someone who made the best of limited means, and in either case it was not a mark against him. His horse, visible at the paddock fence, was a solidly built bay with good condition, and the particular easy posture of an animal that is treated well. "Come to the cellar," she said. "I will show you what I have." She did not thank him for the vat. She had considered it and decided against it. Thanking him would require acknowledging that she had needed the help, which would require acknowledging the limitation, and the limitation was not something she had found a way to acknowledge without it costing more than she could afford. She understood this was a fault in herself. She did not currently have the tools to address it. He seemed to understand something of this, or at least he did not press for the acknowledgement. He simply fell into step beside her, matching her pace without comment. In the cellar, she moved through the shelving with her lantern pulling wheels and unwrapping sections for his inspection with the confident efficiency of a person presenting work they stand completely behind. She watched his face when he tasted the samples she cut for him, the small wedges of the 2-year aged sharp, the crumble-edged cloth-bound, the younger mild she produced for the families with children. He tasted each one the way a person tastes something they are genuinely attending to, not performing appreciation or rushing toward a transaction, but actually present with the flavor. And when he looked up from the 2-year aged, his expression had shifted to something that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it, the look of a person encountering quality they had not fully anticipated. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. "Here," she said. He looked at her, and the simplicity of her answer seemed to settle something in him rather than raise further questions. He nodded once slowly. "I will take 3 wheels of the aged and 2 of the cloth-bound," he said, "and I need to know if the price on the sign accounts for the quality, because if it does, you are undercharging." She looked at him. "I am telling you as a buyer," he said, "which is not in my interest. The sign price should be higher." "I am aware of the market," she said, which was true. She had held the price deliberately, a strategy for volume during the lean months. "Fair enough," he said without pushing it further. She wrapped the wheels in cheesecloth and waxed canvas with the practiced movements of someone who had packaged thousands of them, working at the small table near the cellar door. The lantern light was low and golden, the particular quality of underground light that flattens shadow and warms skin equally without prejudice. She was sealing the last package when she became aware that he was looking at her hands. Men had looked at her hands before. It was never comfortable. Her hands were the most visible evidence of what she was, the most undeniable record of the life she lived and the labor she performed, and people who looked at them too long were usually gathering material for one kind of commentary or another. She kept her eyes on her work, and kept the expression on her face exactly as it was, and prepared herself for whatever was coming. What came was this. "It takes hands that know hard labor," he said. And his voice had dropped into a lower register, quiet and direct, with none of the performance of a compliment, but all of the weight of a genuine observation to craft something this rich, Miss Whitaker. "You are a true artisan." She did not move for a moment. Outside, the wind pressed against the cellar door, and the cheese wheels stood in their silent rows, and the lantern flame held steady in the airtight underground air. And Clara Whitaker stood at her work table with her scarred, swollen, calloused hands resting on a package of the finest aged cheddar she had ever produced, and heard herself described as an artisan, and felt something behind her sternum shift like a stone that has been sitting on a nerve for a very long time. She finished sealing the package. "I will help you load these onto your horse," she said. But something had changed in the underground air of the cellar quiet as the ripening of the cheese around them slow as the long work of time on things made carefully by capable hands. Something had changed, and Clara Whitaker, who had survived 3 years of exile by building her armor one cold morning at a time, stood at the first hairline fracture in that armor and felt the winter air of Cedar Hollow come through it and land for the first time in a very long time on something living. Outside above the ridge the clouds were thickening. Neither of them was looking at the sky. He paid in coin exact, and without haggling, and Clara noted this, the way she noted everything, as data, as information about the nature of a person. Men who did not haggle over a fair price were either wealthy enough not to care or principled enough to consider it beneath them. And one look at the patched coat and the carefully maintained horse told her it was not wealth. He counted the coins into her palm without making a production of it, without the lingering touch that some men used as an excuse for brief contact. And when the transaction was complete, he simply looked at her and said he would be back through the valley in the spring on the return drive north, and that he would need provisions again if she was willing. She said she would be here. She said it the way she said most things, flatly and without decoration, and he received it the way he seemed to receive most things, without requiring it to be more than it was. She watched him ride out from the yard with his 5 wheels of cheese secured in a canvas pack behind his saddle, and she stood in the cold. Long after the sound of the hoofbeats had faded into the pine silence, her hand still faintly warm from the coins that had rested in it, and she told herself with great firmness that she was simply watching to make sure the gate latch caught properly, which was a thing she always checked and had nothing to do with the particular quality of the silence left behind by the departure of a person who had looked at her hands and said artisan and meant it. She went back to the cheese cellar and turned the mid-stage wheels with methodical precision and did not think about it any further. This was what she told herself. The week that followed was an ordinary week, by Cedar Hollow's exacting standard of what ordinary meant. She milked and pressed and turned and salted and waxed. She checked on Patience and the calf, which she had named Stubborn, on grounds she considered self-evident. She made the supply run to the crossroads, trading post in the rattling cart, exchanging 3 wheels of the younger Mild for a sack of salt and a new wax seal and a length of cotton flannel she needed for straining, and she spoke to the trading post operator, a compact, gray-haired woman named Mrs. Aldine, in the clipped and efficient manner of 2 people who respect each other's time and have no surplus of it to waste. Mrs. Aldine mentioned that a cattle drover had been through, bought some dried goods, and asked whether the dairy woman up on the hollow made her own wax or bought it commercial. Clara looked at the old woman steadily. "He asked about my wax." "He did," said Mrs. Aldine with the absolute lack of expression of a woman who has seen enough of human nature to have developed strong opinions about commenting on it. Clara purchased her supplies and drove the cart home in the flat gray afternoon light and spent the evening mending a harness strap and considering the information that a man who was moving cattle through a valley had taken time to inquire about the manufacturing process of her cheese wax, which was either an indication of genuine professional curiosity or something else entirely, and in either case was not information she knew what to do with, and therefore set aside in the part of herself where she stored things she was not equipped to address. 2 weeks after his first visit, she was in the yard resetting a fence post that the frost heave had pushed sideways when she heard the sound of a horse on the cabin track. She did not look up immediately. She was mid-swing on the post driver, and the post was at the critical angle where abandoning it would mean starting over, so she finished the set, drove it down the final 2 inches, and then straightened and turned. Wyatt Callahan was sitting his bay horse at the edge of the yard watching her work with the same quality of attention he had given to the cheese samples, direct and genuinely present, and he raised a hand in a brief, unhurried greeting. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Miss Whitaker." He dismounted and tied the horse to the paddock rail and looked at the fence line with the assessing eye of someone who understood fence work. "That northwest post is going as well," he said. "Frost heave all along this run, I would guess." 2 posts down, 3 to go, she confirmed. He picked up the secondary post driver she kept leaning against the paddock fence and walked to the northwest post without further discussion. They worked the fence line together in the manner she had worked alongside him at the vat, in a silence that was not empty but purposeful. The silence of 2 people who are fully occupied with the same task and have no need to fill the air with noise to justify their mutual presence. She handed tools without being asked for them because she could see when they were needed. He set the post angles by eye with an accuracy that told her he had done this work since he was young enough that it had become instinct. When the last post was set and tamped, he handed back her tools, and she stowed them in the barn and came out to find him examining the barn hinge on the main door, the one she had been meaning to address for 3 weeks and had not gotten to because there were always 12 other things ahead of it. "This hinge is pulling free of the wood," he said. "I know it. Do you have a longer bolt? The original is too short for the load." She found the bolt in the hardware tin she kept on the top shelf of the tack room, and he reset the hinge in 10 minutes with a competence and economy of motion that she recognized as the signature of someone who had fixed a great many things over a great many years and had long since stopped being theatrical about it. When he was done, he tested the door 3 times, the swing and the close and the latch, and then he looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "You did not ride back through for the hinge," she said. "No," he agreed. She considered the honesty of that for a moment, which was considerable honesty to offer without being asked for it, and which she found disarming in the specific and uncomfortable way of things she was not prepared for. "I have fresh bread," she said, "if you have not eaten." It was not a declaration. It was not a performance of something she had rehearsed or decided in advance. It was simply the next true sentence she had available. He ate at her table with the straightforward appreciation of a man who is genuinely hungry and genuinely grateful, and does not dress either condition up as something more complicated than it is. She put bread and hard cheese and cold-cured ham on the board and sat across from him with her own plate, and they ate in the kind of silence that had begun to feel to her cautious assessment like its own form of conversation. He told her when she asked that he had been running cattle drives between the southern grasslands and the northern territories for 7 years, that he had a small permanent holding 2 days east with a good foreman running it in his absence, that he preferred the drives because the open country agreed with him in a way that staying in one place did not entirely. "And yet you keep finding reasons to stop in Cedar Hollow," she said. The directness of this surprised her slightly even as she said it. It was not the kind of thing she typically said. She was not typically a person who brought these things into the open where they had to be looked at directly. He met her eyes across the table with that same level, unperforming gaze. "The cheese is exceptional," he said, "and the company is better than I have had in a good while." "The company," she said with a flatness that was not quite disbelief, but was careful in the way of a person handling something fragile, "has not said more than 40 words to you." "Some people," he said, "say more in 40 words than others manage in 400. She looked at him. He was not smiling in the easy, reflexive way of someone deploying charm. He was simply telling her what he had observed in the direct register he seemed to use for all things, and the sincerity of it landed somewhere in her chest with a weight she had not been expecting and was not sure what to do with. She picked up her bread and took a deliberate bite and looked out the window at the paddock where his bay horse and her oldest dairy cow were standing at the fence rail in adjacent indifference. He left before dark as he had arrived without ceremony. He said he would be back through in a few days if the trail permitted. She said the trail was passable as far as the North Cedar Break, but there was a washout on the East Fork that added half a day if he was coming from that direction. He thanked her for the bread and the information in that order, and she noted this and filed it carefully in the part of herself that was beginning reluctantly and without her full permission to construct an opinion of Wyatt Callahan as a person. He came back in 4 days. He brought with him a paper sack of dried apples from the trading post and left them on the porch without knocking, which she knew because she heard the horse on the track while she was in the cellar, and came out to find them there, the sack sitting on the porch step with no note, which was its own kind of note, and she read it accurately. The visit after that, he chopped wood. She came around the corner of the cabin in the early afternoon to find him at the splitting block with her axe working through the round logs she had been meaning to split for a week, and his coat was draped over the fence rail, and his sleeves were rolled, and he was working with the rhythmic efficiency of someone who is not trying to impress anyone and is simply doing a thing that needs doing because it is there in front of him and he has the capability to address it. She stood and watched him for longer than she intended. She was trying to identify what it was that unsettled her about it. She had received practical help before from travelers who had needed something in return from the trading post operator who occasionally sent her son to carry heavy loads. Help that came with a transaction attached to it was something she understood. She was fluent in transactions. This was something different, and she did not have a name for it. And the not having a name for it was the source of the unsettlement. She brought him water from the spring and did not make a speech about it. Simply set the cup on the fence rail where he could reach it without breaking his rhythm, and he reached for it at the next natural pause, and drank and set it back down, and they did not discuss what was happening between them because neither of them had the precise vocabulary for it yet, and both of them seemed to understand without saying so that naming it prematurely would be a way of ruining it. November thinned into something colder and sharper. The sky took on the particular pewter quality that in Cedar Hollow meant serious weather was no longer a possibility, but a promise. Clara doubled her stores of split wood and verified the cabin caulking and brought the 3 cows into the full enclosure of the inner barn rather than the covered run, and she noted without dwelling on it that the cord of wood in the outer stack was considerably larger than what she had split alone, because he had come back twice more and each time contributed his labor in the same quiet, unremarked way. The storm arrived on a Thursday. She knew it was serious before the first flake fell from the pressure in the air and the particular way the pine trees had stopped moving, the held-breath stillness of a forest anticipating something it is bracing against. She had secured everything she could secure and brought in what needed bringing in and added extra straw to the barn and filled the water cistern to its maximum capacity, and she was crossing the yard from the springhouse to the cabin with an armful of provisions when Wyatt Callahan rode into the yard through the first thick curtain of falling snow, his coat white on the shoulders and his horse blowing hard from pushing through the wind. "The north trail is closed," he said without preliminary. "The drift came down fast across the cedar break. I cannot make it out and back to the main road before dark." She stood in the yard with her armful of provisions and the snow coming down in earnest around her. And looked at him, this man who had been coming and going from her property for the better part of 2 months, who had reset her fence posts and fixed her barn hinge and split her wood and left dried apples on her porch and told her she was an artisan with the same direct honesty he brought to every other thing, and who was now stranded in her yard by a blizzard that was settling into the valley with the clear intention of staying a while. "Put your horse in the barn," she said. "Second stall, there is a full hay rack." She did not know what to do with the relief she felt that he was not going to be trying to ride out in this. She folded it up and put it away for later and went inside to build up the fire. The snow came down for 6 hours before either of them understood that it was not stopping. The cabin was warm enough through the first evening. They ate salt pork and cornbread, and she brewed tea from the dried herbs she kept in a row of small tin canisters on the kitchen shelf, and they sat at the table across from each other in the lamplight and talked more than they had in all the previous visits combined. Or rather, he talked when she asked him things, and she listened in the thorough way she had always listened, storing information with the same care she stored the records of her cheese production. He told her about the drives, about the particular quality of a plains night when the herd is settled and there is no sound, but the grass and the stars are unreasonably numerous overhead. He told her about the holding 2 days east, the good pasture and the creek that ran clear even in dry summers, the foreman, a steady man named Rhett, who had been with him since the beginning. He talked about these things without boasting and without apology, and she pieced together from the spaces between what he said and what he did not say that he was a man who had built something real from his own effort and who understood the particular loneliness of being the person responsible for keeping it all together. She understood that loneliness. She understood it with a precision that she typically kept private. By midnight, the temperature inside the cabin had dropped enough that their breath was visible, and Clara understood what she had already suspected, that the cold coming through the floor and the walls was not the ordinary cold of a Cedar Hollow winter night, but something more aggressive, the kind of cold that finds the gaps in construction that were always there but never mattered before, and turns them into vulnerabilities. She sat with her hands wrapped around her teacup and made the calculation that needed making. "The cheese cellar," she said. He looked at her. "It holds a constant temperature, the stone walls and the airtight door. It will not get below 40 degrees in there, regardless of what happens outside." She paused. "It is not comfortable, but it is survivable, which the cabin may not be in another 4 hours." He looked at the frost that was beginning to form on the inside of the window glass. He looked at her. He did not make it complicated. "Tell me what to bring," he said. They carried what they needed in 2 trips: the wool blankets from both beds, the lantern and the oil, the remaining food, the tea tin, the water jug. She locked the animals from the cellar side. The barn was connected to the cellar by the stone foundation, and she could hear the cows moving in the shared wall, their warmth adding to the aggregate temperature in a way that was not nothing. The cellar was not large. It was perhaps 12 feet by 14, the shelving taking up both long walls and leaving a central aisle that was adequate for one person moving through it, but became significantly more intimate with 2 people and their bedding arranged on the flat stone floor between the cheese wheels. The lantern sat on the lowest shelf and cast its amber light up through the aging wheels and across the mortared ceiling and the smell of the cave. That ancient, complex, living smell of time and culture and patient craft was very present and very close. They arranged the blankets on the stone floor with the practical attention of 2 people who are focused on survival, and then sat in the small space of their separate territories and listened to the muffled howl of the storm above them, reduced by 30 feet of earth and stone to a distant, almost theoretical sound. Clara sat with her back against the shelving and her knees drawn up and her hands, those broad-scarred, capable hands, resting on her knees, and she was aware with every nerve she possessed of how close he was. Not inappropriately close. The space simply did not permit distance. He was perhaps 3 feet from her. His long legs extended his back against the opposite shelving, the lantern between them, throwing its light equally in both directions. She had not been this physically close to another person in a very long time. She was not prepared for how much that fact had weight. She had told herself for 3 years that she did not require proximity, that she had been designed by constitution and by circumstance for solitude, that the exile had in fact been a gift, a clearing away of the pretense that she had belonged anywhere near the social world that had evaluated her and found her wanting. She had built her life around this premise, with the same careful craftsmanship she brought to the cheese testing each element for structural integrity, refusing to build on anything that would not hold weight. The premise had held, or she had believed it had held, and the believing had been sufficient. But the cellar was very close, and the storm was very real, and Wyatt Callahan was 3 feet away from her in the amber light, with his eyes resting on the middle distance in a way that suggested he was thinking rather than performing. And she had been telling herself a story about herself for 3 years, and sitting in this particular moment, she was not certain how much of it was true. He moved. It was a simple movement. He reached across the space between them and lifted the heavy wool blanket that was pooled beside her and drew it up across her shoulders with a careful, deliberate gentleness, and the back of his knuckles brushed the side of her neck. The barest incidental contact less than a second. She flinched back as if she had been struck. It was not a decision. It was older than decisions, older than thought, the response of a body that had been braced for contact to mean something painful for so long that the reflex had become indistinguishable from instinct. She pulled herself to the far wall, and the blanket fell, and she was on her feet in the narrow aisle without knowing fully how she had gotten there, and the shame of the reaction came immediately behind it, the heat of it in her face, the familiar and despised vulnerability of having been seen to flinch, and she turned it the only way she knew how to turn it. "Don't," she said, and her voice was harder than she had intended hard with the effort of containing everything behind it. "Don't touch me like I'm something that needs handling. I know what I look like, Mr. Callahan. I know what I am. I am not a woman you comfort. I was not built for that." She was breathing as though she had been running. In the silence after her words, the storm pressed against the earth above them, and the cheese wheels stood in their patient rows, and the lantern flame held absolutely steady in the airtight underground air. He had not moved back. He had not flinched from her words or rearranged his expression into the careful blankness of a man managing an inconvenient female display. He was simply sitting with his elbows on his knees, looking up at her with that same direct, ungoverned attention, and his face held something she could not immediately name because she had not seen it directed at her before. It was not pity. It was not patience in the condescending register of someone waiting for the storm to pass so they could proceed with their original plan. It was something more substantial than either of those things. He reached out and she tensed, and he was slow enough and deliberate enough that she could have moved away, and he would not have pressed it, but she did not move away. And he took both of her hands in both of his and turned them palm up in the lantern light, her scarred and swollen and calloused hands, the hands that had been the evidence of everything they had said about her, and he pressed them against his jaw, her palms against his stubbled face, and held them there. She felt the warmth of his skin against her roughened palms. She felt the specific, undeniable reality of his face, the angle of his jaw, the coarse texture of a week's beard, the fact of him as a living person who was choosing to do this, who had decided that her hands on his face was the correct response to this moment and was not embarrassed by that choice. Then he drew her hands down and pressed them flat against his chest over his heart, and she felt the steady, entirely real beat of it through his shirt and through her palms. He looked up at her. "This body," he said, and his voice was quiet and even, and without any of the trembling theater of a man making a speech, kept you alive through winters that would have finished most people. It carried this operation on its back for 3 years. It kept me warm tonight." He paused, and when he continued, his voice dropped to the particular register of a thing said once that does not require repetition. "Don't you ever insult my woman again, Clara, even when that woman is you." The storm moved above them, reduced to its distant theoretical sound by 30 feet of earth and stone and time. Clara Whitaker stood in her cheese cellar with her hands pressed against a man's heart and felt the armor she had been building and reinforcing and repairing for 3 solid years develop a crack that went all the way through clean and structural. The kind of crack that does not mean the thing is broken, but means it has been tested by something real and has finally at the deepest level been found to be something other than impenetrable. She did not cry. She was not built for crying in front of people, and she did not start now. But she sat back down in the space between the cheese wheels, and she did not move all the way to the far wall, and she let the heavy blanket rest across her shoulders, and she sat with her hands in her own lap, and looked at the lantern flame with the particular quality of attention she gave to things she was trying to understand. Outside, the blizzard pressed itself against the valley with the full authority of a cedar hollow. January, indifferent and thorough, and completely without mercy. Inside the cellar, surrounded by the rich and living smell of 3 years of careful work, Clara sat 3 feet from a man who had called her his woman in the same tone of voice he used to report observable facts, and the flame held steady, and the cheese wheels aged in their patient rows, and something that had been frozen for a very long time began without permission to consider the possibility of thaw. They did not sleep much that night, not because of the cold which the cellar held at bay with the steady competence of stone and earth doing the work they were built for, and not because of any awkwardness that required managing, but because the storm outside was a living sound, even muffled as it was, and because there is a particular quality to underground lamplight in the middle of a blizzard that makes sleep feel beside the point. They talked instead, or rather the talking found them the way certain things find people when the ordinary protections of daily business have been stripped away by weather and proximity and the simple animal fact of shared survival. Clara talked more than she had talked in 3 years combined, and she did not fully realize this until much later when she was able to look back at that night with the perspective that time eventually provides. In the moment, it felt less like talking and more like a door she had not opened in a long time, swinging on its hinge because someone had fixed the hinge and the door had no more excuse to stay shut. She told him about the cheese cultures, how she had isolated the specific strain she used for the 2-year aged from a batch that had developed spontaneously in the 3rd month of her first year, and how she had recognized in it something worth preserving, and had maintained it with daily attention ever since feeding it and tending it with the same consistency she gave the animals. She talked about the limestone water and why she believed it contributed to the mineral complexity of the final product, and about the temperature differential between the cellar's north wall and south wall, and how she used that gradient to manage different stages of aging in the same space. He listened to all of this without the glazed tolerance of a man waiting for a subject to change. He asked questions that were specific enough to indicate he was genuinely following the technical thread of what she was saying, and when she explained something he had not encountered before, he received the information with the engaged attention of a person who finds the world interesting and has not exhausted that interest. She asked him about the cattle operation, not the drives, but the holding itself, the land and the breeding program, and the long-term plan for it. And he talked about these things with a care and precision that mirrored her own when she spoke about the cheese, and she understood from listening to him that what he was building east of the valley was not simply a business enterprise, but a considered relationship with a particular piece of ground, the same kind of relationship she had developed with Cedar Hollow, built from sustained attention and respect for what the land could and could not do. At some point in the deep middle hours of the night, the lantern oil burned low, and they let it go, rather than refilling it from the spare tin, and the cellar settled into a darkness that was not frightening, but simply complete. The total darkness of underground spaces that have been dark since before anyone was there to care about it. And they continued talking in the dark for a while, and then the talking slowed and eventually stopped, not abruptly, but with the natural diminishment of 2 people running out of wakefulness rather than words. Clara was aware in the last moments before sleep found her that she was warm. Not the functional warmth of adequate shelter, though the cellar was providing that, but a different kind of warmth, the kind that originates from inside rather than outside, from something being present that had been absent for long enough that its return felt almost like a physical sensation. She identified this awareness and did not know what to do with it, and carried it with her into sleep. She woke before him. She woke in the way she always woke, completely, and immediately her mind engaged before her body had fully committed to the process, and she lay still for a moment in the profound darkness and listened to the storm. It had quieted considerably. The howling that had been a presence even through 30 feet of stone and earth had reduced itself to something more like wind, ordinary winter wind, without the structural intent of a blizzard behind it. She felt for the lantern and the tin and refilled it by touch with the ease of someone who knew the shape of everything she owned, and she lit it with the flint she kept on the shelf, and the cellar came back into its amber existence around her. Wyatt was asleep against the opposite shelving, with his coat drawn up over his shoulders, and his face in the relaxed, unguarded arrangement of a person who does not sleep in fear of what the world will do while they are not watching it. Clara looked at him for a moment with the freedom that looking at a sleeping person provides the ability to observe without being observed in return, and she noted with the same objectivity she applied to everything that he was in the calm of that cellar morning, a person she trusted. This was not a small thing. She trusted in the ordinary operational sense of the word very few people, and most of them were not human. She trusted Patience the heifer to behave predictably during milking. She trusted the spring to run clear. She trusted the limestone ridge above the cellar to hold its weight. These were trustworthy because they had been tested by time and had not failed the testing. Wyatt Callahan had not been tested by time, not nearly enough of it, and yet the word sat next to his name in her mind with a naturalness that was itself a kind of data. She set the water tin on the small spirit lamp she kept in the cellar for warmth and made tea, and was drinking her first cup when he came awake in the clean, uncomplicated way of someone whose body and mind are in reasonable agreement about the basic arrangement of the world. He looked at the lantern at the tea at her, and said good morning in the voice of a man who means it as a simple statement rather than a performance, and she poured him a cup, and they sat in the amber cellar light and listened to the storm diminishing above them. "It is passing," she said. "Yes," he said. "The drift over the North Trail will take 2 or 3 days to clear enough to pass." He looked at his cup. "I am not in a hurry," he said. She considered the honesty of this for a moment, which was considerable honesty again offered without pressure or calculation, and she set it next to the other accumulation of honest things he had said and done, and let it rest there. "There is work to be done in the barn," she said. "The storm will have stressed the structure." "I will help," he said. "I know," she said, and the knowing was matter-of-fact and unornamented and true. They emerged from the cellar into a world that had been remade overnight. The snow was deep enough to require effort to move through it in the yard, coming above the knee in the open spaces, and drifted waist-high against the north wall of the cabin and the barn. The sky had cleared to the hard, brilliant blue that follows a serious storm in the high country, and the light on the snow was almost painfully sharp, every surface edged and crystalline in the early morning air. The barn had held. The roof had taken some load on the north slope, and she examined the main beam with care and determined it was stressed, but sound, and she made a note in her internal accounting to reinforce the connection at the ridge before the next heavy snow. The animals were unsettled, but uninjured. Stubborn, the calf was pressed against Patience's flank with an expression Clara privately categorized as a thorough renegotiation of his relationship with the concept of winter, and she found this more reassuring than she would have expected. They dug out the yard together, working from the cabin door outward, in the logical progression of a person planning the sequence of necessary tasks. He was efficient with a shovel in the same way he was efficient with all physical work without waste or showmanship, and they worked in the cold morning air and the exceptional light without needing to coordinate through speech, because the sequence of what needed doing was self-evident to both of them, and they were both the kind of people who looked at self-evident work and did it. He stayed for 2 more days while the North Trail cleared. These were not days of grand declaration or deliberate romantic construction. They were in most of their particulars simply working days, the kind that Cedar Hollow produced without apology, regardless of what was happening in a person's interior life. There was feeding and milking and pressing and turning. There was the reinforcement of the barn ridge beam, which he undertook with the focused attention of a man who takes structural problems seriously. There was the clearing of the path to the spring and the checking of the root cellar for frost damage and the resetting of a section of paddock fence the storm had pulled loose. But they were also days of a different kind of accumulation. She showed him the full process of the cheese from the morning milk through the cooking of the curds and the pressing and the salting and the waxing, and he followed the sequence with a focus that was not performative interest, but the genuine engagement of a person encountering a craft they had not previously understood. He asked questions that were better questions each time, and when she corrected something in his understanding, he received the correction without defensiveness and integrated it immediately, which she found she respected considerably. She let him taste the batch of 2-day fresh curds that were not yet committed to any particular destiny, still plastic and mild, and watched his face process the flavor. And when he looked at her, she told him that what he was tasting was essentially the raw material, the thing before the craft had been applied, the beginning, rather than the end. "It is already something," he said. "It is the possibility of something," she said. "That is different." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had begun to recognize as his thinking expression, the look that indicated he was examining what she had said for its full extent rather than its surface. "You think that about a lot of things," he said, "the difference between what something is and what it might become." She considered whether this was true and found that it was more comprehensively than she had previously articulated, and she said so, and then added that in her experience, the gap between a thing's current state and its potential was where most of the important work happened, and he said he thought that was right, and the sentence sat between them with a weight that was not entirely about cheese, and they both knew it, and neither of them required the other to say so. On the second evening, he found her on the porch after supper, standing in the cold with her coat over her shoulders and her hands wrapped around a tin cup, watching the stars assert themselves over the ridge in the way they do in high country after a storm has cleaned the atmosphere. She heard the door and did not turn around. He came and stood beside her, and for a while they were simply two people standing in the cold, looking at an unreasonable quantity of stars, which was, she had to acknowledge, a situation with its own inherent freight. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. He did not rush it or dress it up. He simply said what was true in the direct register he used for all true things. He said he had been stopping in Cedar Hollow for 2 months on grounds that he had told himself were various and practical, and that were actually singular and not practical in any conventional sense, and that he was a man who had learned long ago that not saying true things aloud had a cumulative cost, and that the cost of not saying this particular true thing had gotten to a level he was no longer willing to pay. She listened to all of this with her hands around her cup and the stars overhead and the cold pressing in from the ridge. "I am not an easy person," she said. "I have not been looking for easy," he said. "I do not know how to be soft," she said. "I tried once a long time ago. The lesson I was taught about it was a hard one. I did not repeat the experiment." "I am not asking for soft," he said. "I am asking for Clara." She looked out at the ridge for a long moment. The stars were very numerous. The cold was very real. Beside her stood a man who had lifted a vat with her and fixed her hinge and split her wood and pressed her hands against his heart and called her his woman in the tone of voice he used for observable facts. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I built what I have here from nothing on terms I set for myself, and I will not subordinate it to someone else's plan. Not for sentiment, and not for warmth, and not for any other reason." "I understand that," he said without pause. "My work is mine," she said. "My craft is mine. My decisions are mine." "Yes," he said. "Simply that." She looked at him. "You are not arguing. "There is nothing to argue with," he said. "I am not interested in taking anything from you, Clara. I have my own land and my own operation, and I did not ride through Cedar Hollow looking for something to acquire." He paused. "I rode through Cedar Hollow and found something I was not looking for, and I am telling you that plainly because you are a person who deserves plain speech." She was quiet for a long time. The stars moved the small, careful increment that stars move when you stand still and watch them, and the cold settled deeper into the night around them, and at some point she became aware that the arm of his coat was against the arm of hers in the narrow space of the porch, and she had not moved away from it, and he had not made a production of it. "I will consider what you have said," she told him. "That is all I am asking," he said. They went inside, and she built up the fire, and they sat at the table with their respective cups and did not discuss it further that night because it had been said, and saying it again would have been the wrong kind of addition. He left the following morning when the north trail was sufficiently clear to pass, and he loaded his horse in the clean, cold dawn light, and she stood in the yard, and they looked at each other across the space of the practical yard with its practical equipment and its cords of split wood and its barn full of cows. "Spring," he said. "Spring," she agreed. He rode out through the cedar brake, and the sound of the hoofbeats diminished into the cold morning silence of the valley, and Clara stood in the yard for a moment and then turned and went back to work, because the morning milking was waiting, and the mid-stage wheels needed turning, and the day made its demands with the complete indifference to personal experience that Clara had always found depending on her mood, either deeply frustrating or deeply reliable. This morning she found it reliable. She found it reliable because the work was hers, and the valley was hers, and the cellar full of patient aging cheese was hers, and somewhere in the past 2 days something that had been building had been acknowledged aloud by both of them and set down carefully in the space between them to wait. The way a wheel of fresh cheese is set on the shelf to begin the long, unhurried work of becoming what it is capable of becoming. She pressed the new batch and salted it with the precise measurement her experienced hand knew without needing a scale, and she turned the mid-stage wheels and noted their rinds in the ledger, and she milked the 3 cows in the steady rhythm that was simply part of her now, and she did all of this with the same thoroughness she brought to every working day. And if she was doing it this morning with something slightly different in her chest, a quality of presence that was neither heavy nor weightless, but simply more than she had been carrying the day before yesterday, she did not make a note of it in the ledger. Some things did not require notation to be real. December settled over Cedar Hollow with its full authority. The days grew short, and the cold grew certain, and the work did not diminish because the season had made itself inhospitable. It simply changed its character, became more about maintenance and preservation and the careful management of what was already built, rather than the expansion of it. Clara moved through the shortened days with the efficiency of a person who has learned to extract full value from limited light starting before dawn and finishing by the last gray hour before dark. He came back twice in December, once in early and once in the final week before the year turned. The early visit was 3 days, the second only one constrained by the trails and by whatever obligations waited for him at the holding. He brought salt the first time, a full 50-pound sack he had freighted in from the township because he had passed the trading post and noticed Mrs. Aldine was running low on the grade Clara used, which meant Clara's next supply run would not be able to fill the full order. She stood in the yard holding the salt sack and looked at him. "Mrs. Aldine told you what grade I use," she said. "She did not take much convincing," he said. "I imagine not," she said with a flatness that contained in its deepest register the faint geography of something that was not quite a smile. She put the salt in the spring house and fed his horse and made supper, and they sat at the table, and this time the conversation came more easily, not because the previous difficulty had been replaced by comfort exactly, but because they had both added more information to the existing store and were both better equipped to make use of what they were building than they had been at the beginning. He told her more about Rhett, the foreman, who had a wife and 3 children at the holding and who ran the operation with a competence Wyatt trusted entirely, but who had been sending letters with increasing frequency suggesting that certain decisions about the spring breeding program were awaiting his return. "You will go back before spring," she said. "After the year turns," he said. "Rhett is right that I have stayed away too long. The operation needs its owner present for the breeding decisions." She nodded. This was practical information, and she received it practically. "I will write," he said, "if you will read what I send." She looked at him across the table. "I will read it," she said. "And write back," he said. Not a question exactly, but a sentence with a question living inside it. "I do not write letters," she said. "I have never had occasion to." "You will find you have," he said, with the quiet certainty of a man making an honest prediction rather than an empty one. She considered this and found to her own mild surprise that she did not argue with it. The second December visit was brief and practical, and they spent most of it working side by side in the barn, reinforcing the north wall's interior facing where the frost had worked at the mortar. He had a facility for masonry work that she had not expected and mentioned so, and he told her his father had been a stonemason before the land took him, and that the hands learn things they keep regardless of what the mind intends. She thought about hands that keep what they learn. She thought about this later in the cellar, when she was alone with the aging wheels and the amber light turning the thought over in the way she turned a ripening wheel, checking all its surfaces, attending to what was developing. Her own hands had kept everything her life had required of them. They had kept the milking rhythm and the pressing pressure and the precise salting weight and the particular grip on the post driver and the shovel and the axe. They had kept the temperature sensitivity required to judge a rind by touch. They had kept 3 years of hard-won knowledge without losing a day of it. They had also kept, she was beginning to understand, the flinch, the reflex that had pulled her back from his knuckles in the cellar that first blizzard night. They had kept the particular vocabulary of bracing that her body had learned when she was still a girl, being told what she was and what she was worth and what she could expect from the world on the basis of what she looked like and how much space she took up. The hands keep what they learn. The question she was sitting with in the amber light, with the storm-cleaned winter pressing down on the valley above her, was whether what the hands had learned could be revised. Whether a body that had encoded a certain set of lessons about itself and about the nature of being touched and seen could receive new information and, given enough careful repetition, begin to encode something different. She did not know the answer, but she was for the first time in 3 years genuinely asking the question, which was itself a kind of answer, the small preliminary answer that is not a conclusion but a direction. Outside the cellar door, the winter settled its full weight on Cedar Hollow, cold and thorough and indifferent as winters always are, not cruel, simply honest about what it requires of the things that intend to survive it. The cheese wheels stood in their patient rows, turning slowly in the dark, toward what they were capable of becoming, the living chemistry of time and culture and careful tending, doing its unhurried work on things that had been made with attention and skill and the particular kind of stubborn love that does not announce itself but is present in every stage of the making. Clara Whitaker sat with her hands resting in her own lap and let the winter do its honest work, and waited for spring with the same quality of patience she gave to everything she had learned to trust. The letters came. She had not been entirely certain they would not, because she doubted his word, but because she had learned through long experience that the world's intentions and the world's follow-through were 2 different animals, and the gap between them was where most of the damage happened. But the first letter arrived on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of January, carried by a freighter who knew Mrs. Aldine at the trading post, and had been asked to deliver it up the hollow track, and Clara stood in the yard with the folded paper in her hands for a long moment before she went inside and sat at the table and opened it. He wrote the way he talked, plain and direct and without ornament, but with a precision of word choice that indicated he had thought about what he was saying before he said it. He wrote about the holding and the breeding decisions and the particular difficulty of a late-season cold snap that had stressed the younger stock. He wrote about Rhett's youngest child, a girl of 3, who had apparently decided that the barn cats were her personal responsibility and was pursuing this mandate with a dedication that impressed everyone and inconvenienced the cats considerably. He wrote about the drive he was planning for early spring south first and then back north through the valley, and he wrote at the end without preamble or exaggeration that he had thought about Cedar Hollow every day since he left it, and that he hoped the winter was treating her and her operation with more consideration than it typically extended to things worth keeping. Clara read this last sentence 3 times. Then she put the letter in the tin box she kept in the bottom drawer of the kitchen dresser, the box that contained her land deed and her business accounts and the single document that represented everything she had built and everything she intended to protect. And she went back to the cellar and turned the wheels and made her notations in the ledger and spent the rest of the day working with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. That evening she got out paper and a stub of pencil and sat at the table and wrote back. She had told him she did not write letters. This was true in the sense that she had never had occasion to, but she discovered as she sat with the paper in front of her and the fire built up behind her and the winter pressing dark and cold against the cabin windows that she had in fact been composing things in her head for years, observations and assessments and the particular quality of thought that comes from living alone with a mind that does not stop working simply because there is no one present to direct it at. The letter took her 2 hours and 3 discarded attempts, not because she did not know what to say, but because she kept saying too much and then removing it in the interest of the same economy she applied to everything else. The final version was 1 page. She wrote about the new batch of cave-aged. She had started the most ambitious aging project she had attempted yet targeted for 18 months and requiring a specific temperature management she was still refining. She wrote about Stubborn, who had proven himself to be exactly what his name suggested and had now developed the habit of leaning against the barn door until it swung open, which meant she had added a second latch at his shoulder height, and he was currently engaged in working out the engineering of this new obstacle with an expression of profound professional interest. She wrote at the end that the winter was doing what Cedar Hollow winters did, which was everything it could to determine what was worth keeping and that she was still here. She sent it with the next freighter heading east. The correspondence that developed over the following weeks had a quality she had not anticipated. It was not the breathless urgency she had sometimes observed in other people's romantic exchanges, the kind of communication that runs on want and impatience and the charged energy of unconsummated feeling. It was something quieter and more structurally interesting than that the exchange of 2 people who were genuinely curious about each other's actual lives, who were building letter by letter a map of what the other person was made of. He sent her a sketch rough but accurate of the holding's layout, the pasture configurations and the creek line, and the position of the main structures with small notations in his precise handwriting explaining the reasoning behind certain decisions. She studied this for a long time at the kitchen table, reading the land through his description of it, the way she read the valley she lived on, looking for the logic of how a person and a piece of ground had come to their mutual arrangement. She sent him in return the actual formula for the limestone culture she had isolated and maintained, written out in the precise notational shorthand she had developed for her own records, with an explanatory note translating the shorthand into plain language. She had not shared this formula with anyone. It was the core of what made her operation irreplaceable, and she knew it, and the act of writing it out and folding it into an envelope and sending it east was a thing she did very deliberately and with full awareness of what it meant. His return letter said simply that he understood what she had sent him and that he was keeping it in the same place he kept his land deed. February passed, and then March, and the valley began its slow negotiation with the idea of spring, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes, first the creek running high and loud with melt, the particular mud season of Cedar Hollow arriving in all its inconvenient glory. Clara worked through it as she worked through everything methodically and without complaint, adjusting her routines to account for the changed conditions and the changed demands. She was aware in the way she was aware of changes in weather that something in herself had shifted over the winter. It was not a dramatic shift. It did not announce itself or require acknowledgement. It was more like the change in the air that precedes the first true warm day, a quality of possibility that had not been present before, a sense that the atmosphere was capable of something other than cold. She did not trust this entirely. She was not built to trust warmth without verification. But she noted it the way she noted everything as information, as data about the current state of things. She also noted with the same objectivity she tried to apply to all subjects that her father and brother had sent word through the trading post. The word arrived in the form of a brief message delivered by a teenage boy she did not recognize, written in her father's cramped and intermittent hand on the back of a scrap of brown paper, saying that the family intended to visit Cedar Hollow in the spring, and that she should expect them before the wagon trains began their run. No date. No stated purpose. No question about whether she was well or what she needed or how the winter had treated her. Simply the announcement of an arrival as though she were a stop on a route rather than a person in a place she had made her own. Clara read this message once, folded it precisely, and burned it in the kitchen fire that evening. She did not require the paper. She had noted the information, and the information was stored where she needed it in the part of her mind that managed threats to what she had built, the same vigilant, accurate part that assessed weather and structural integrity and the condition of a cheese rind for signs of what was developing beneath. She wrote to Wyatt the following day. She told him plainly and without drama that her father and brother intended to visit in the spring, and that their last communication 3 years ago had involved her mother describing her as a liability and her father making it clear that her value to the family was conditional on her ability to generate income that benefited them. She told him this not because she required his intervention, but because she had determined over the course of the winter's correspondence that he was a person she was in the practice of telling true things to, and this was a true thing that was relevant to the current situation. His return letter arrived in 9 days faster than usual, which told her he had sent it with some urgency. He wrote that he would be leaving the holding within the week for the southern drive, and that his route through Cedar Hollow was already planned. He wrote that he was not coming because she had indicated she needed protection, which he understood she had not, but because the spring drive brought him through the valley regardless, and because Cedar Hollow was where he intended to be when the ground thawed enough to make it accessible. He wrote that whatever she needed from him, more presence or less a witness or a wall or simply someone standing at her back while she handled her own business, he was prepared to provide it on her terms. On her terms. She read this twice. Then she folded it and put it in the tin box with the others. The warming came in earnest in the second week of April, the kind of warming that Cedar Hollow produced when it finally committed to the season fast and thorough and without apology for the months it had withheld it. The south slopes went from snow to mud to the first tentative green in the space of 2 weeks, and the creek settled from its frantic melt running into the steady, clear current that would sustain the valley through the summer. And Patience led her calf into the outer paddock for the first time, and Stubborn stood in the thin April sunlight with his nose lifted and his expression suggesting he was reserving judgment about the whole arrangement. The wagon trains would start within the month. Clara had been preparing for the season since February, timing the maturation of her primary stock to coincide with the peak of demand, and the cellar was in the best condition it had ever been in the inventory. Deeper and more varied than any previous year, the new cave-aged project progressing with the slow promising development she had hoped for. She had expanded the spring house the previous fall with lumber she had purchased from the trading post and installed herself over 3 long weeks, and the additional capacity meant she could hold considerably more fresh product in the critical first weeks of the wagon train season, when demand outpaced her ability to produce. She was in the yard on a Wednesday morning, assessing the south fence line where the frost heave had done its usual work, when she heard horses on the cabin track. She knew before she looked up. She knew from the particular quality of the sound, two horses moving, with the deliberate pace of people who have come with purpose, rather than the loose ranging movement of travelers passing through. And she knew from something older than sound, the specific tension that moves through a body when it recognizes a threat. It has known for a long time, and has not entirely finished being afraid of. She straightened and turned, and there they were at the edge of the yard, her father and her brother, and they looked exactly as she remembered them, and exactly as she had feared they would look, which was like men who had arrived to claim something. Her father was a broad man, gone to heaviness in the years since she had seen him, with a face that had always resembled a door that was never quite fully open, and eyes that assessed everything in front of him for its utility and found most things wanting. Her brother Thomas was taller and leaner and had inherited their father's assessment habit without, in Clara's experience, the minimal restraint that occasionally tempered it in their father. They dismounted, and her father looked around the yard with the slow, proprietary thoroughness of a man taking inventory. "Clara," he said, not a greeting, a notation. "Father," she said. "Thomas." Her brother's eyes moved over the spring house, the expanded barn, the cellar entrance, the cart with its good wheels and solid flatbed. He was calculating. She could see the calculation happening as clearly as if he were doing it aloud. "You have done well for yourself," her father said, and the tone of this was not admiration. It was the tone of a man who has found something he had written off and discovered it has value after all, and is now adjusting his plans accordingly. "I have done well for myself," she agreed, and her voice was even, and her hands were still at her sides, and she was standing in the full, grounded solidity of her own body, in the center of her own yard, which she had built and maintained and defended through 3 winters of solitary effort, and she was not going to be moved from it. Her father dismounted and tied his horse to the paddock rail with the casual ease of a man who assumes the paddock is available to him, and looked at her directly for the first time. "We have business to discuss," he said. "Come inside." "We can discuss it here," she said. Something moved in his face, a brief recalibration of his approach. He had expected she understood a different Clara than the one standing in front of him. He had expected perhaps the girl he had sent away, the one who had absorbed the verdict of her family's assessment and carried it in her posture and her eyes. That girl had spent 3 winters becoming someone else. He told her what he had come to say, with the directness of a man who does not see the need to soften what he considers a practical matter. There was a debt, a substantial debt, accumulated through a series of decisions he presented as unfortunate rather than reckless, owed to a creditor in the township. The creditor, a man named Aldous Greer, whom Clara knew by reputation as a man whose patience for waiting and kindness for debtors were both considerably shorter than his desire to profit from other people's difficulty, had indicated a willingness to settle the debt in full in exchange for the Cedar Hollow property and the dairy operation which he would absorb into a larger commercial enterprise he was building in the valley. There was a secondary arrangement her father added with the same flat practicality. Greer had also indicated a willingness to take Clara as part of the settlement in the formal capacity of a wife, which would provide her with a home and a position, and would resolve the matter cleanly for all involved parties. The silence that followed this was the kind of silence that has mass. Clara stood in her yard in the April morning with the new green showing on the south slope behind the barn, and the smell of the limestone spring in the air, and the sound of the creek running clear in the distance, and she looked at her father and understood several things simultaneously. She understood that he had never, not for a single day of her life, been capable of seeing her as anything other than a resource to be managed. She understood that the 3 years she had spent in this valley had not changed this, and were not going to change this, because what she had built here was not something that reached him as evidence of her worth as a person, but simply as an asset that had materialized in a place he felt entitled to access. She understood that the wound he had given her all those years ago was real and would always carry its scar, but that the scar was not the wound, and the wound was not her, and the 3 years of building and the cheese cellar and the limestone culture she had isolated and the correspondence in the tin box with the land deed were all of them more real than the story he had always tried to tell about her. Thomas had moved during their father's speech to the edge of the yard nearest the spring house, and she noted this with the peripheral awareness she kept for spatial information, the awareness that had told her in November which way a drift was developing, and in the cellar that first night which way the temperature was moving. "I want to hear what Clara says," said a voice from the barn doorway. Both her father and Thomas turned. Wyatt Callahan was standing in the open barn door with his coat on and his hat in his hand, and his posture entirely relaxed, the posture of a man who has not been invited into a situation but is not apologizing for being in it either. He had arrived. Clara understood sometime in the last hour quietly, and without announcement, which meant he had heard most or all of what had been said. Her father looked at him with the evaluating eye. "Who are you?" "Wyatt Callahan," he said. "I run cattle through this valley. Miss Whitaker lets me stable my horse when I am passing through." He paused. "Who are you?" The simplicity and the directness of this, the asking of an obvious question as though the answer were not already known, was a thing Clara recognized as its own kind of precision, and she registered it and set it aside because there was something more important that needed addressing first. Her father began to speak again, returning to his subject with the patient persistence of a man who believes repetition is a form of argument, and Clara listened to him for exactly as long as it took her to be certain of what she already knew, which was that this conversation had one correct conclusion, and she was the person who needed to reach it. But first, the ground shifted. It shifted because Thomas, who had been drifting toward the spring house with the casual movement of a man pretending to look at something of general interest, said something under his breath about the clumsy girl their mother had always said would end up costing the family more than she was worth, and the words were quiet, but the yard was not large, and Clara heard them with perfect clarity. She felt the familiar architecture of the old wound, opening the specific practiced cruelty of people who know exactly which words reach the place where armor has not yet fully closed. And for a moment that lasted approximately the time it takes a candle flame to react to a sudden draft. She was 17 again, and standing in a kitchen being told what she was, in the voice of someone who had decided that truth and utility were the same thing. The moment passed. It passed because she was standing in her own yard, and she had 3 winters in her bones, and she had an 18-month aging project in the cellar that was going to be the finest cheese she had ever produced, and she had a tin box in the kitchen dresser that contained a land deed with her name on it, and a stack of letters from a man who had pressed her hands against his heart and meant every word he had said since. The moment passed, and then the paranoia moved in, where the wound had been the way one weather system replaces another, and it was less like thought and more like a chemical reaction, sudden and total, and not fully within the control of the person experiencing it. She looked at Wyatt in the barn doorway. He had come. He had arrived quietly and positioned himself without fanfare, and he was here in the yard where this was happening, and her mind, the part of it that had been braced against betrayal for so long that the bracing had become structural, offered her the question it had been holding in reserve since the beginning. "Did you know?" she said, and her voice came out with a flatness that was its own kind of alarm. "How well the business was doing before you started coming through?" He looked at her steadily. "Did someone tell you about the land and what it was worth?" She heard herself saying it and heard the wound talking underneath the words and could not stop either one. Mrs. Aldine at the trading post, the freighters, someone who knew the operation, someone who knew my family might have a claim. "Did you come here knowing there was something to be gained?" Her father had gone very still in the way of a man who recognizes a development that is useful to him. Wyatt did not move from the doorway. He did not perform offense or arrange his face into the careful arrangement of wounded innocence. He simply looked at her with the same direct, clear gaze he had brought to everything since the first day in the yard with the vat, and he let her words sit in the air between them without rushing to dispel them. "No," he said. One word, flat and simple and without decoration. "How do I know that?" she said. "You do not," he said. "Not from what I say right now standing here. You know it from 9 months of watching me. You know it from what a person does when they think they are not being evaluated. You know it from the wood I split that you did not ask me to split, and the hinge I fixed that I did not tell you about, and the salt I brought when the trading post was running low." He paused, and his voice did not rise or harden. "You know it the same way you know whether a rind is developing true or false. You read what is there. You have been reading me since August, Clara. You know what you have found." The yard was very quiet. Her father opened his mouth and Clara turned to look at him, and whatever he saw in her face caused him to close it again without speaking, which was possibly the most useful thing he had done in her presence in her entire life. She stood in the April morning with the wound aching and the paranoia receding like a tide that has reached its limit and cannot hold its high mark, and she breathed one long, deliberate breath and looked at Wyatt and found that he was exactly where he had been in the doorway, unhurried, not filling the silence with anything. It did not require simply present. He had stepped back as he always stepped back when she needed space. He had not left. In the barn behind him, she could hear his bay horse moving in the second stall, the comfortable shifting of an animal that is at ease in a familiar place. And the sound of it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and it reached her with an unreasonable precision, the simple evidence of a man who had come back enough times that his horse knew where it was supposed to be. She turned back to her father. "I have heard what you came to say," she said. "Now I will tell you what I have decided." And she went inside to get the tin box. The tin box was exactly where it always was, in the bottom drawer of the kitchen dresser beneath the folded spare cloth, and the extra candles she kept for the cellar. Clara pulled it out and set it on the table and opened it with the small brass key she wore on a cord around her neck, and she stood for a moment looking at its contents, the way a person stands before something they have built over a long time, taking its full measure before they act. The land deed was on top, as it always was. Her name was on it in the county clerk's careful copperplate hand, Clara Ann Whitaker. The date 3 years prior, when she had paid the final installment of the purchase price, she had negotiated directly with the original landowner, an elderly widower who had respected the quality of her offer and the directness with which she had made it. Beneath the deed were the business accounts in her own precise notation, 3 years of income and expense, recorded with the accuracy of a woman who understood that numbers do not lie, and that her numbers were the clearest argument available for the value of what she had built. And beneath those, the letters folded and ordered by date, occupying more space in the box than anything else it contained. She took the deed and the accounts and left the letters where they were, and closed the box and locked it, and put the key back against her sternum, and carried what she needed back out into the April yard. Her father and Thomas were standing where she had left them, and Wyatt was still in the barn doorway, and the morning had not changed in any of its particulars, except that Clara Whitaker had changed in the minute she had been inside, or rather, had finished changing, the way a wheel of cheese finishes its change not with drama, but with the quiet arrival of what it has been becoming all along. She crossed the yard and held out the account ledger to her father, open to the current year's page. He looked at it with the involuntary attention of a man who has come to acquire something and is now confronted with the scale of what he was proposing to take. She watched his eyes move down the columns and saw the precise moment when the numbers exceeded whatever figure he had estimated in his head, because his jaw tightened in the specific way of a man recalculating, and she felt something cool and clear move through her that was not satisfaction exactly, but was the functional cousin of it. "This is the operation you are proposing to settle Greer's debt with," she said. "Look at those numbers carefully, Father. What you owe Aldous Greer and what this dairy produces in a single season are not the same figure, and you know it. You did not come here to settle a debt. You came here because the debt gave you a reason to come." He handed the ledger back. His face had rearranged itself into the expression she remembered from childhood, the expression that preceded a hardening of position, the face of a man who has been shown that he is wrong and has decided to proceed anyway. "The law does not require your permission," he said. "An unmarried woman's property under current statute is subject to family governance in matters of debt and obligation. I have spoken with men who know the law in this county." "And I have spoken with the county clerk," Clara said. "6 months ago, when I updated the deed registration and had my business standing formally recorded in the Township Commercial Registry in my name and my name alone as an independent enterprise. The clerk was very helpful. He noted that women operating as sole traders under formal commercial registration hold independent legal standing for their business assets in this territory." She paused. "I know the law too, Father. I have known it since I understood that one day you might look at what I built and decide it belonged to you." This was entirely true. She had made the trip to the county seat on a cold November morning with the deliberate foresight of a woman who understood that the structures that protected her were only as strong as the documentation supporting them, and she had spent the better part of a day with the county clerk, ensuring that every element of her legal standing was as solid as the stone walls of her cheese cellar. The clerk, a thin and meticulous man named Horace, had been impressed by the thoroughness of her preparation and had told her so in the formal, appreciative tone of a bureaucrat encountering genuine competence in his domain. Her father's eyes had gone flat and hard, the eyes of a man who has found a door locked that he expected to be open. Thomas had moved again. She tracked him in her peripheral vision the way she tracked the drift pattern of a developing storm cataloging its direction and pace. He had moved toward the business sign she kept mounted on the paddock gate post, the hand-painted board that read Whitaker Dairy, Cedar Hollow, Aged Cheeses and Fresh Dairy, the sign that had directed wagon trains to her door for 3 seasons, and that had become, in its modest and weathered way, the visible declaration of everything she had made of this valley. He reached up and put both hands on the sign. "I would stop," said Wyatt from the doorway. Thomas turned. Wyatt had moved from the doorway to the yard, unhurried 3 steps that brought him to a position that was not aggressive, but was unambiguous, the position of a man who has drawn a line with his body rather than his words. Thomas looked at him with the assessing contempt of a young man who has spent his life measuring other men for weakness. "This is a family matter," he said. "Then keep it to the family," Wyatt said. He was looking at Thomas with the same level, undramatic attention he brought to everything, and there was nothing theatrical in his posture or his expression, only the complete and very legible stillness of a man who has decided something and is not going to be argued out of it. "Put your hands somewhere else." Thomas looked at his father. Her father gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind that means proceed, and Thomas turned back to the sign and began working it loose from its mount. Clara was already moving. She did not run. Running was not the correct instrument for this moment. She walked steadily and with the full weight and purpose of a woman who knows where she is going and why to the corner of the barn where she kept the heavy leather work satchel she used for the supply runs. The one with the reinforced bottom gusset she had added herself because the original stitching had not been adequate to the loads she typically carried. She picked it up and walked to the center of the yard, directly between the paddock gate and where her father was standing, and she set it down in the mud of the April yard with a sound that was dull and solid and significant. It was her savings, not all of it. She was not a woman who kept all of anything in one place. But it was the portion she kept liquid and accessible in the cabin safe, 9 months of the dairy's net income after operating costs, and it was a substantial amount of money by any honest assessment of what a substantial amount of money meant in this territory. She looked at her father. "There is your debt," she said. "Count it if you need to. It will cover what you owe Greer, and leave something remaining which is more consideration than you gave me when you sent me to this valley with 1 cow and the expectation that I would simply disappear from your accounting." Her father looked at the satchel. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was complex and not entirely readable. and she thought she saw in the deepest register of it something that might have been shame, but it was brief, and it did not stay, and she did not require it to stay. She was not doing this for his shame. She was doing this for the same reason she had done everything for 3 years, because it was the correct action in the situation, and she was the person capable of taking it. "Take it," she said. "Take it and settle your debt with Greer and ride out of this valley. I am buying my own freedom from whatever claim you believe you hold. That is a legal transaction witnessed by 2 people standing in this yard. When you leave here, Father, you leave here with no further claim on anything in Cedar Hollow. Not the land, not the operation, not the sign, and not me. Not for debt, and not for marriage, and not for any other arrangement you have made with any other person. It is done." Her father looked at the satchel in the mud for a long moment. Then he looked at her with the full, direct look he had rarely given her in her life, and she held it without flinching, standing in the spring morning in the yard she had built with the limestone smell of her spring in the air and the sound of her cows behind the barn wall, and 3 years of her own competence in every structure around her. And she looked back at her father with the steady, undefeated eyes of a woman who has discovered that the people who told you what you were worth were simply wrong. He bent and picked up the satchel. She had known he would, not from cynicism, but from the accurate assessment of the man in front of her, who had always ultimately operated on the basis of what was immediately available to him, and who would not refuse what was directly in his hand for the sake of a longer fight that was no longer guaranteed to go his way. He did not say anything. He turned and went to his horse and mounted, and Thomas, who had released the sign without having fully removed it, followed, and they rode out of the yard without looking back, their horses making a diminishing sound on the track through the pines, and then the sound was gone, and there was only the creek and the birds and the April wind moving through the cedar brake. Clara stood in the center of the yard for a moment and felt the stillness settle around her. Then her father came back. She heard the single horse returning before she saw it, and she turned, and he was at the edge of the yard again. Alone this time, Thomas apparently having continued down the track. He sat his horse and looked at her from that distance, and his face had the look of a man who has something in him that is trying to get out, and that he is not sure he has the equipment to let out. And she watched him with the patience of a woman who has learned to wait for things to arrive at their own pace. "Your mother," he said, and then stopped. She waited. "Your mother said things," he said, "that were not right. I knew they were not right when she said them. I did not say so." He looked at the pommel of his saddle. "I am not asking for anything. I am just saying that." Clara looked at her father across the yard and felt the full, complicated weight of what it is to be the child of a person who was not equal to what parenthood required of them, the grief of it that does not go away, and the understanding of it that does not fix the grief but can coexist with it the way 2 things can occupy the same space if they have both accepted the terms of the arrangement. "I know," she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not its absence either. It was simply the truest thing available. He nodded once and turned his horse, and this time he did not come back. She listened to the hoofbeats until they were gone, and then she stood in the silence of her own valley and breathed the April air and felt moving through her in the place where the old weight had been something she recognized after a moment as lightness. Not the giddy, precarious lightness of a person who has not yet fallen, but the solid structural lightness of a load that has been set down after being carried for so long that the body had forgotten what it weighed. She heard a step behind her and did not flinch. Wyatt came and stood beside her in the center of the yard, and they stood together in the way they had stood on the porch in December, looking at the unreasonable quantity of stars side by side, and not performing anything for each other or for the empty yard or for the pine trees or for anyone at all. "You had it handled," he said. "I did," she said. "The county clerk," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite amusement, but was its thoughtful relative. "November. I am not a person who waits for problems to arrive before I address them," she said. "No," he said, "you are not." They were quiet for a moment, and the valley was quiet around them, and the April morning continued its business of being warm and clear and indifferent to the human drama it had just hosted. Then Wyatt moved. He moved the way he always moved, without excess, with the deliberate economy of a person who has thought about what they are doing before they do it. And he went down on one knee in the spring mud of the Cedar Hollow yard, the mud that still held the faint impression of the satchel that had bought 3 years of silence and a clean departure. And he looked up at her. He was not performing this. There was no theater in his posture, no studied arrangement of his face into the expression of a man making a romantic speech. He was simply a man on one knee in the mud of a dairy yard in the April morning, looking up at the woman in front of him with the same direct, honest gaze he had brought to every moment since the first day with the vat. "I do not need your land," he said. "I have my own. I do not need your business, because you run it better than anyone I have ever encountered, and it does not require my management or my money or my opinion." He paused, and his voice was quiet and even, and carried in it the weight of a man who has thought very carefully about what he is about to say, and has decided that the truth, plain and complete, is the only offering worth making. "I need the woman who kept me warm in that cellar in January. I need the woman who isolated a limestone culture and shared the formula with me, like it was the most important thing she had ever trusted anyone with, and I understood that it was. I need the woman who bought her own freedom in the mud this morning without waiting for anyone to buy it for her." He looked at her steadily. "Let me be the man who stands at your back, Clara, while you keep ruling this valley." The creek ran clear in the distance. The cows moved in the barn. Somewhere on the south slope above the cabin, the first true green of the Cedar Hollow spring was working its way up through the last of the winter's claim on the earth patient, and certain doing what it had always done regardless of how long the cold had lasted. Clara Whitaker stood in her yard and looked down at Wyatt Callahan kneeling in the April mud, and she felt the full architecture of the past 3 years. The exile and the cold and the solitary labor and the letters in the tin box and the blizzard night in the cellar and the cracked armor and the paranoia and the bought freedom and the father riding away with the complicated truth of him in his posture, she felt all of it simultaneously, the whole weight and substance of it, and she let herself feel it completely, the way she had learned to let the limestone water do its full work on the cheese, not directing it or constraining it, but trusting it. Trusting that what was real would produce what was true, if you gave it the space and the time it needed. Then she reached down and took both of his hands, her scarred and calloused and capable hands around his, and she pulled him to his feet. "Yes," she said, "just that." One word, flat and simple and complete, in the same register she used for all true things, with no decoration and no qualification and no armor between herself and the full meaning of what she was saying. He stood in front of her, and he did not make a production of it, did not sweep her up or make a speech or frame the moment in the theatrical vocabulary of men who have practiced this. He simply stood and looked at her with everything in his face that he had been carrying since August, the full sum of 9 months of quiet, sustained, unperforming care. And he brought her hands up between them and held them the way he had held them in the cellar, not gently in the fragile sense, but gently in the deliberate sense, the way a person holds something they recognize as valuable. She let him. She stood in the April morning of her own valley, and she let the warmth of his hands be real, and she did not manage it or limit it or translate it into something safer, and the doing of it was not easy in the way that things are easy when they cost nothing, but it was the correct kind of difficult, the kind that is the cost of getting something right. The spring that followed was the best season the Cedar Hollow Dairy had ever produced. The wagon trains came in numbers that exceeded the previous year by 1/3, and Clara's operation was ready for them, the expanded spring house holding its capacity, the cellar inventory deeper and more varied than any prior season, the new cave-aged project reaching its 8-month mark with a complexity in the rind that told her the 18-month projection was going to be worth every day of the wait. She worked the season with the same focused competence she had always brought to it. And the difference was not in the work itself, but in the yard where a bay horse was increasingly a permanent resident rather than a visiting one. and in the table where two people sat in the evenings with their respective teacups, and the productive silence of people who have enough to say to each other that they do not need to fill every moment with it. Wyatt made 2 short drives that spring and summer obligations to buyers he had committed to before the yard in April, and he returned from each one with the easy certainty of a man who knows where he is going when the drive is done. He brought Rhett his foreman through Cedar Hollow in June, and Rhett was a compact, perceptive man who looked at the dairy operation with genuine professional interest and looked at the two of them together with the expression of a person who had been expecting something and found that what he had expected was correct. "She is exactly as you described her," Rhett told Wyatt within Clara's hearing, which she suspected was not entirely accidental. "I described her accurately," Wyatt said. "You described her better than accurately," Rhett said. "You described her like a man who was paying attention." Clara, who was at the cheese table and ostensibly occupied with the salting of a new batch, said nothing, but something in the set of her shoulders shifted by a degree that anyone paying the right kind of attention would have noticed a small involuntary loosening the degree of movement that belongs to a person receiving something they were not braced against. They were married in September by the circuit preacher who passed through the valley on his biannual route in the yard of the Cedar Hollow cabin on a morning that had the sharp, clear quality of early autumn in the high country, the sky so precisely blue it seemed less like atmosphere and more like intention. Mrs. Aldine from the trading post came, and Rhett and his wife and their 3 children and a family of wagon train regulars who had been buying Clara's cheese for 2 years and who had somewhere along the way become the closest thing to friends she had permitted herself. The calf stubborn observed the proceedings from the paddock fence with an expression of comprehensive skepticism that Clara found entirely appropriate. The preacher was a brisk and sensible man who performed the ceremony without unnecessary elaboration and asked them both the questions that needed asking, and they answered each one directly and without hesitation, in the same register they used for all true things. When it was done, Wyatt looked at her with everything still in his face that had always been there, unchanged by the formality of what had just been said, because the substance of it had been established long before the words were spoken, and she looked back at him with the full, unguarded clarity of a woman who has stopped requiring distance as a proof of safety. And she thought, with the quiet certainty of someone who has learned to trust what has been tested, that this was what it felt like to be known. The October morning that Wyatt opened the 18-month cave-aged wheel was a Sunday, and Clara was standing at the cellar workbench with her sleeves rolled and her hands ready, and she watched him work the rind seal with the careful attention of a man who understood that this moment had been building since the previous February, and deserved the respect of full presence. The interior of the wheel was everything she had been working toward. The color was the deep complex gold of long aging, and the grain had the crumble-edged density she had been aiming for, and when she lifted a small piece and tasted it, she stood for a moment with her eyes closed and the taste of 3 years of accumulated knowledge on her tongue, the limestone water and the isolated culture and the precise temperature management and the 18 months of patient, unhurried time, all of it present in the flavor with the clarity of a thing made well from good materials by a person who had given it everything she had. She opened her eyes and found Wyatt looking at her. "Well," he said. "Better than I projected," she said. He tasted it and did not speak for a moment, and then he looked at the wheel and at her and at the cellar around them, the lantern light and the shelving and the patient rows of aging cheese, and he said quietly, "You made something extraordinary here, Clara." "I know," she said, and the saying of it was simple and unashamed, the statement of a fact about herself delivered without apology, and she felt the full, uncomplicated truth of it land in her chest and stay there. 2 years after that September morning in the yard on a Wednesday that was ordinary in all its working particulars, Clara stood at the paddock fence in the early afternoon with a child on her hip. He was 18 months old and solidly built, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's broad, capable hands, and an expression of permanent interested assessment that both his parents recognized as his own. His name was Eli, chosen because it was the name of the elderly widower who had sold Clara the land 3 years before she met Wyatt, a man who had told her when he signed over the deed that a woman who worked as hard as she did deserved a piece of ground that would work as hard back, and whose assessment she had thought of on many mornings since. Wyatt was at the cellar entrance with a freshly opened wheel of the 3-year aged, the successor to the 18-month batch, cut open for the inspection of 2 merchants from the township who had ridden up the hollow, specifically because word had reached the commercial registry in town that Whitaker Dairy was producing the most consistently exceptional aged product in the territory, and they wanted to discuss a formal supply arrangement. She watched him speak to them with the straightforward confidence of a man representing something he believed in completely, and she watched the merchants lean in to look at the cut surface of the wheel with the involuntary attention of people encountering quality they had not fully anticipated. And she shifted Eli on her hip and felt the spring sun on her shoulders and looked out over the valley that was hers, that had always been hers, that she had built from cold mud and solitary labor, and the kind of stubborn, undefeated persistence that does not announce itself but is present in every stage of the making. The dairy had expanded in the 2 years since the wedding, the 3rd cow become 5. The cellar capacity doubled by an addition they had built together the previous fall with Rhett's help, and a week of the particular combination of hard labor and sustained argument about structural approaches that Clara had come to understand was one of the authentic languages of her marriage. 2 people who had strong opinions and the mutual respect to express them directly, who built things better together than either would have built alone. The cattle operation east of the valley was running as well as it ever had, Rhett holding it steady through the drives that were now shorter and less frequent, Wyatt having made the calculation that the holding 2 days east and the dairy in Cedar Hollow were together a more complete thing than either was separately, and that the man who managed this combination well was a man with something worth managing, which was a different kind of richness than simply the accumulation of either operation alone. Eli reached out one broad, small hand and grabbed a strand of her hair with the decisive grip of someone who has identified something interesting and intends to investigate it thoroughly. "You are your father's child," she told him. He looked at her with those dark, assessing eyes and did not release the hair. "You are also mine," she said. She said this quietly and without performance in the simple register of true things, and she felt it land in the same place that all true things landed, the deep and gradually warming place in her chest that had been frozen for so long that the thaw had taken the better part of a year, and had felt at its most difficult like damage before it felt like recovery. It had been recovery. She heard Wyatt step behind her and did not flinch, had not flinched from that particular sound since a blizzard night in January when something old had cracked and something new had begun its slow underground work in the dark, the way the best things grow in the steady temperature of patient tending and the unhurried chemistry of time. He came and stood beside her, and she passed him Eli, who transferred his grip from her hair to Wyatt's coat collar with the seamless efficiency of a child who has learned that both parents are reliable infrastructure, and Wyatt settled the boy on his arm and looked out at the valley with the particular quality of attention he had always given to things he valued full and present and without reservation. "The merchants want a standing order," he said, "monthly. They are talking about a volume that would require the full cellar capacity." "Tell them they can have it," she said, "on the condition that the pricing reflects the quality and not their preference for what quality ought to cost." He looked at her. "I know the number I want," she said. "I will give you the figure." "I know you will," he said, and the warmth in his voice was not the warmth of a man managing a woman with expectations, but the warmth of a man who has spent 2 years watching someone he loves operate at the full extent of their capability, and has found that watching this is one of the better things his life has offered him. Clara Whitaker, who was now also Clara Callahan, but who had kept Whitaker in the business name because it was the name on 3 years of reputation, and she had not built that reputation to retire. It stood at the paddock fence of the Cedar Hollow Dairy on a spring Wednesday with her husband and her son, and looked out at the valley. She ruled the valley that had received her exile, and her grief and her calloused hands and her stubborn, unconquerable persistence, and had given her back over 3 years of patient, relentless making everything that the small and frightened voices of her past had told her she was not built to have. She had been built for precisely this. She had known it for a long time now, not from what anyone had told her, because no one who had the power to tell her early had been capable of the honesty, but from the accumulated evidence of her own life tested against the hard and indifferent standards of Cedar Hollow winters, and the even harder standard of learning to let warmth be real without flinching away from it. The cheese wheels were aging in their patient rows in the cellar behind her, the limestone culture doing its quiet work in the dark, and Eli was attempting to remove Wyatt's hat with the focused professionalism of someone who has identified a clear objective and intends to achieve it, and the valley was green and loud with the creek and the spring birds and the sign on the paddock gate, Whitaker Dairy, Cedar Hollow. Aged cheeses and fresh dairy stood solid in the morning light. The paint renewed the previous fall, the post set deep and level and true. She had set the post herself. She had set all of them from the beginning, and they had held, and they would hold, and she was not finished building yet, not by a long measure, and she intended to build for a very long time.